It's the Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Last month was Mental Health Awareness Month, and during the month we spent a lot of time talking about the big challenges that families are having, especially parents with their children when it comes to mental health challenges. One thing that we didn't talk about at all, because I've been waiting for this conversation, even though it's around about 6 weeks overdue now, was a conversation about anxiety. We talked about depression, we talked about ADHD, we talked about autism, we talked about parents who are cracking and experiencing burnout, but we didn't touch on anxiety. And that's because I knew that the Royal Children's Hospital Health Poll, the RCH National Child Health Poll about anxiety in children, was coming out. It actually did come out a while ago, but it's been really hard for me to find the space and the time to track down Dr. Anthea Rhodes. Anthea is a paediatrician, a researcher, a child health advocate, and she runs the RCH Health Poll and has been on the podcast a few times to talk about its findings. The latest one was all about anxiety in our kids, and Dr. Anthea Rhodes joins me right now to talk about the poll. Great to have you along, Anthea. The poll found that parents are reporting that half of their kids are experiencing problems with anxiety. Was this much of a surprise to you?
Yeah, great to be here, Justin, and talk about this topic today. It was not really a surprise, and I think as a parent, as you are, and most of the listeners out there will be, and also as a doctor, anxiety is everywhere at the moment. That's the sense we're getting, and doing this survey and asking parents out there to tell us about what's happening in their homes has really confirmed that. So around half of parents reported that their children had had some challenges with anxiety. Most of those children had what would be called moderate challenges, or parents might have described it as somewhat of a problem, with a smaller proportion, around 12%, having a really big challenge with anxiety.
So, Anthea, this was a poll that was conducted exclusively in Victoria.
Yes.
To what extent do you think that this is a function of the exacerbated and significant lockdowns that Victoria experienced compared to much of the rest of the nation?
Look, it's really difficult to say exactly, which elements caused what, but we definitely know from other research as well that lockdown, some of which we did here through the health poll where we looked at experiences in Victoria compared to experiences in other states and territories in Australia where the restrictions were different. For the most part, they were shorter and less severe, and we saw that impacts were greater in Victoria. So there's definitely a dose relationship, if you like, related to lockdown that is probably playing out here for Victorian families. But that said, there are lots of other factors that look to have contributed to beyond just the lockdown. So for families who are not in Victoria, there was still a lot of limitations around travel perhaps, and the ability to see and get support from family members, interstate or perhaps overseas. There was a lot of worry and anxiety and anticipation about possible lockdowns, which in itself was stressful, even if that lockdown didn't, eventuate. And of course, there were experiences that were financial for a lot of families too. And 1 in 4 to 5 families in Australia had some sort of financial pressure related to the pandemic and the restrictions. So change of work, loss of income, and those sorts of things all feed into anxiety in households that, children live, feel and experience. So lots of things about the pandemic, not just the lockdown itself, but all of those things having an effect.
And those financial challenges have just shifted with the inflation issues that we're dealing with, the interest rate hikes and that kind of thing. Anthea, I want to ask you a question about the overall findings here with anxiety from a parenting point of view. What are you finding in relation to parents understanding what anxiety is and how it's affecting their children, or even knowing what they should be looking for in children? I mean, anxiety has kind of become the common cold of mental illness. It used to be depression, but nowadays it's anxiety. And sometimes I meet parents who are convinced that their children have anxiety because they're worried, because they're having a rough old time. But obviously there's a massive difference between being worried, being apprehensive, having some anxiety, and having an anxiety disorder. What did you find in the poll?
Absolutely. So anxiety itself is a normal thing. So it's a type of worry that children and adults will experience in response to stress. And that is something that we have all the time in different ways. Every day there will be elements of worry or fear or anxiety. And responding to those is part of how we develop, and it's a healthy thing. So it is important for us not to, if you like, overcall anxiety or decide that every little worry represents a big problem. The challenge, as you've described, is where do we understand that line that means those worries or anxieties have become more of a problem and what we would describe in a medical sense as a disorder or a condition. And that's really hard for parents. And we actually found that, that was something that about a third of parents said that they were not confident about. Right. They wouldn't know when those worries and fears actually represented a problem that they might need to seek help for. So the really important thing, and that I talk about all the time with families, is thinking about function. So that means getting on with the regular activities of life. If you have anything affecting that, then you really do have something of a problem. So if we think about it for adults, if an adult has worries or anxiety that mean they aren't able to get to work, or perhaps they're not able to socialise with other people, they're in the house a lot, they're not interacting, or they're withdrawing from activities, then we would say, oh, I think I'm worried about that person. This might be becoming a problem for them. Very similarly for kids, we have to think about, well, what are their sort of essential functions? What do we need and expect them to be able to do to have a happy, healthy life? And that means interacting with their friends, their peers, socialising. That means getting to school, or for younger children, getting to kindergarten, being able to go and engage and learn and thrive, being able to do the everyday things like eat and sleep, not perfectly every day, but enough that you don't feel like this is affecting their ability to just get on with life. So for families, I say, if these things are affecting your child's ability to get on with life and it's ongoing, for more than at least a period of a few weeks, then that is a sign that perhaps something more is going on there and it's time to reach out for some help.
What are kids most anxious about?
So in our study, we asked specifically about school and kindergarten environments, and this was one of the biggest sources of anxiety that parents had noted. Now, that might also be because it's something that's more obvious. We know that kids need to go to these places every day, and if there's a challenge getting them there, it's really clear. We can't avoid it easily, and it stands out as an issue. So that separation for school or kindergarten is one of the more commonly identified sources of anxiety that parents told us about. But then there are other things that might be an issue as well. So that could be, interacting socially in other settings, so perhaps sports or other extracurricular activities. It might be really specific to an activity at home, so it might be anxiety around eating, it might be anxiety around sleeping or going to bed. For some children, they may have a really specific phobia or a fear of something in particular, and that could be anything from spiders to heights to small spaces, the sorts of things that we know about as adults as well. So it can show up in all kinds of ways.
When I see these data and compare it to some recent research that came from, actually it's not that recent now, it's a little bit older, but I compare it to some data that's come out from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I think among children aged 12 to 18, anxiety is now the number one disorder, the number one thing that's creating dysfunction in our kids. It's obviously a growing problem. And this may be a little bit speculative. I don't know if you collected data on this or not, Anthea, but outside of issues related to going to school or things related to the lockdown, what do you think is driving the increase in anxiety? Like, why do you think that kids today are more anxious than they were? I've got a few hypotheses, but I'd love to know what you think. Why are kids more anxious today than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly 40 or 50 years ago?
Yeah, well, we definitely haven't studied this. I'll, put that up front,
yeah.
And that would be quite a complex thing to try and study. But there are lots of theories there, and there are some things that we do know that might help us to understand this. So what is it that helps people to be less anxious? And, are we doing enough of that? And that's one of the things that we often think about and can reflect on with kids and with adults as well. And that's having time to be disconnected, to actually have some space mentally, to have enough sleep and rest and downtime to actually, if you like, switch the brain off and recharge so that it's not operating at a really high baseline all the time, meaning that little things can tip it up into a state of anxiety. So what we really know about our society now is that we're all, living at a very fast pace, and that's happening to our kids as well. So from a younger and younger age, they're connected digitally, they're online, they're communicating with friends, with family, they're thinking about things all the time, and that adds a level of stress. Not all stress is bad, but if you have a constant high level of stress, then it makes it much more likely that you might tip into a state where things are becoming a problem. So I feel like it's probably a reflection of a lot of things that are happening in the way we live. And then the other theory, if you like, that's part of this is that we're maybe a bit better at recognising things than we used to be as well. So we hear about anxiety more, and some of that might be because it is happening more, and we've had lots of things happen in our lives, as we've talked about in the last few years in particular, that certainly have contributed to anxiety. But we're also better at spotting it and talking about it and calling it out. And so maybe some of it's always been there, but we haven't recognised it as much. I reflect on, someone I knew growing up, for example, who used to have, we grew up and went to a school where we went to church, and every time there was a church service, she would be vomiting and sort of have to leave. And there was this theory that, the idea was, she's allergic to the incense, and that was why she had to go out. But in fact, as she got older, it became apparent that she really had a fear of large crowds and being in a small space. But no one even thought about that. Everyone decided it was something physical, and no one was thinking about anxiety. This is a while ago. I'm getting on, and I think we've really progressed a long way since then. But there are many situations like that where perhaps we didn't spot the signs, and we're still not always able to spot the signs, and we found that in our study again. But I do think we're getting better at it. So some of the increased anxiety is maybe us just knowing that it's there, and some of it is probably a result of the way we're living.
So I'm going to do a bit of a summary of everything we've talked about. There's so many things that we've touched on, and they matter. First off, around about half of parents, or half of children aged 3 and over, I should say, are experiencing problems with anxiety. You said that I think just over a third, I think 36% are experiencing somewhat of a problem, and I think you said 12% are experiencing a big problem with anxiety. That's kids over 3. The second thing that I heard you say that really stood out to me is that a lot of parents are struggling to differentiate between kids that are having a tough time, being a bit worried about something, and actually experiencing anxiety, and are therefore not quite sure when they should seek help. And the third big take-home message that I've picked up from our conversation is that we can reduce the likelihood that children will experience dysfunction with anxiety, because anxiety is normal and healthy, and it keeps us alive, right? Anxiety is actually something that we need in our lives, just not too much and not at the wrong times. But what I'm really hearing you say is sleep, exercise, nature, good relationships, those things are shown empirically to be really, really valuable. The last thing that I want to ask you about, and I think this is probably the most important thing of all, is if I've got a child who's struggling, if I'm not sure if they've got anxiety or not, I mean, they're still functioning, but they're maybe a bit miserable. They're refusing to participate in some activities. They require a lot of coaxing, a lot of effort. Maybe they're a bit emotional, perhaps withdrawn. Where do I go for help? Where do I go to find out? What advice would you give to parents if they just want to either get some assurance that things are okay and this is just a temperamental thing with the child, or if they need to know that they are actually dealing with something a little bit more serious?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've developed a great suite of resources for this exact sort of situation, Justin, online. So rch.org.au/anxiety, where we've got some resources there to help parents think through those possible signs, and also links to a number of really great online programs, which is often a good place for parents to start, that can support them with some strategies around that anxiety and help them to recognise, whether this is more of a problem or something that they might need more help for. The other thing that I think is really important is talking to your child's school teacher or kindergarten teacher, or if they're younger and in perhaps an early learning environment, the educator there is a really helpful thing to do early as well. They've often got a really good insight into how your child is coping outside of home, and they understand kids and kids' development very well, and can also often offer some strategies and some thoughts about, what you might do next. Of course, the GP is also a fabulous place to start. And where you need it, being linked in then with a counsellor or a psychologist to get some strategies. And I really would encourage parents to do that early if they're feeling concerned, because the other really important thing that we know is that if you can get a few strategies happening early on, perhaps at the beginning of some of those problems, it's going to be a lot easier to actually improve things than if you wait a long time and the problem's more entrenched. It can be much more difficult, to undo patterns and learn new skills to cope with that anxiety.
Really appreciate that advice. We will link to the RCH anxiety page in our show notes for parents that want more information. Love talking to you. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Anthea Rhodes, paediatrician and head of the RCH National Child Health Poll. Always love talking to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, Justin.
Yeah, wonderful conversation. We love checking in with Dr. Rhodes and getting the latest from the National Child Health Poll when they come out, and we'll bring you more evidence when we get the next data through. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And for more information about making your family happier, visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.